The rain came down hard over Itaewon that Tuesday evening, turning the narrow street into a river of neon reflections. Adaeze Bello pulled her thin cardigan tighter and hurried past the shuttered stalls, her grocery bags cutting red lines into her palms. She wasn't looking for trouble. She was looking for the last bus. That was when she saw the old woman. Crumpled against the wall of a shuttered pharmacy, a small Korean grandmother sat in a puddle of rainwater, her cane knocked just out of reach. Her basket of vegetables scattered across the pavement like something had exploded out of her hands. Passers-by stepped around her. One young man filmed her on his phone and kept walking. Nobody stopped. Adaeze stopped. She didn't know this woman. She didn't speak much Korean beyond what she'd picked up working double shifts at a Seoul restaurant for the past 3 years. But she knew what it looked like when someone had been knocked down by the world and left there. "Halmoni," Adaeze said softly, kneeling despite the wet pavement soaking through her jeans. "Grandmother, are you hurt?" The old woman's eyes, sharp, startled, unused to kindness from strangers, locked onto hers. What Adaeze didn't know, what she couldn't have known, kneeling in that rain with a stranger's spilled cabbage floating past her knees, was that this frail woman's name was one that made grown men in tailored suits lower their voices. That somewhere across the city, in a penthouse office 40 floors above the Han River, a man was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. And that the groceries Adaeze was about to quietly pay for, refusing the old woman's trembling, grateful hands, would become the reason her entire life unraveled, and then rebuilt itself into something she never dared to imagine. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. If stories about family, justice, and unexpected miracles inspire you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story. Adaeze Bello was 29 years old, and Seoul had never once felt like home, though she'd stopped admitting that out loud, even to herself. She'd come from Enugu 4 years ago on a work visa that promised more than it delivered, chasing a dream that had started with her mother's voice. "Nay, go, build something. Send something back. We are counting on you." Her mother had died 8 months after Adaeze arrived, a stroke, sudden, merciless. And the money Adaeze had been sending home now went instead to her younger brother Chidi, still finishing his studies in Lagos, and the small church congregation in Itaewon that had become the closest thing she had to family. She worked mornings at a laundromat and evenings at a Korean-Nigerian fusion restaurant tucked behind Noksapyeong Station, run by a stubborn, warm-hearted woman named Iya Ronki, who'd been in Korea for 2 decades and still couldn't pronounce half the subway stops correctly. Adaeze slept 4, sometimes 5 hours a night. She hadn't taken a full day off in over a year. She was, by every visible measure, someone the city had already forgotten. But there was something in her. A stillness, a stubborn dignity that refused to disappear no matter how many landlords looked past her, how many customers spoke slower and louder as though she were deaf rather than foreign, how many nights she cried alone in a one-room office-tel with peeling wallpaper and a window that didn't quite close. She had a wound she didn't talk about. Not the loneliness. She'd made peace, or something like it, with the loneliness. It was the guilt. The last conversation with her mother had been an argument, cut short by a bad connection and Ayaze's own exhaustion. "I'll call you back tomorrow, Mama." There had been no tomorrow. That single unfinished sentence lived somewhere behind Adaeze's ribs, and it was, perhaps, the reason she couldn't walk past an old woman lying helpless in the rain. She helped the Halmoni to her feet, gathered the scattered vegetables, bruised cabbage, a burst bag of anchovies, ginger rolling toward the gutter, and refused, 3 separate times, to let the trembling woman pay her back for a fresh bag of groceries from the convenience store across the street. "Please," Adaeze said, pressing the bag gently into the old woman's arms. "My mother would want someone to do this for her, if she were far from home." The old woman studied her for a long moment. Her eyes, Adaeze would later realize, held something far too calculating for a woman supposedly lost and helpless. "What is your name, child?" "Adaeze." "Ah, a queen's name." The old woman almost smiled. "Do you know who I am?" "No, Halmoni. Should I?" Something flickered across the old woman's weathered face, amusement, sorrow, and something colder underneath both. "No," she said finally, gathering her cane. "Not yet." She refused a taxi. She refused an escort. She simply vanished into the rain-slicked alley the way she'd appeared, leaving Adaeze standing there with wet knees and an inexplicable chill crawling up her spine, the sense that she had just crossed paths with something far larger than an act of kindness to a stranger. She had no way of knowing that 3 miles away, a black sedan was already pulling up outside that same alley, dispatched the instant the old woman's bodyguard, the one she'd deliberately given the slip 20 minutes earlier, reported her missing. She had no way of knowing that the man stepping out of that sedan, jaw tight with barely restrained panic, was the most feared and respected figure in Seoul's underworld of legitimate empires and illegitimate shadows, or that he was about to be told, in a trembling voice over the phone, that his grandmother, the only family he had left, the woman who had raised him after fire and blood took everything else, had just been found. Found safe, found cared for. By a stranger. By the time the sedan's headlights swept across the wet alley where Adaeze had stood minutes before, she was already 3 blocks away, humming a hymn under her breath, utterly unaware that somewhere in that black car sat a man staring at a grainy CCTV photo on his phone. Her face, captured mid-kindness, with an expression his own men had never once seen on him. Not rage, recognition. The man in the black sedan was Kang Ji-hoon, and the last time anyone in his organization had seen that particular expression on his face, it had been 11 years ago at his grandfather's funeral. He stared at the photo a second longer, then a third, before finally speaking. Where is she now? Home, sir. Safe. She insists she wasn't in any danger. His driver, a broad-shouldered man named Suho, who had been with the family since Ji-hoon was a teenager, hesitated before adding, "She also insists we not touch the girl." Ji-hoon's jaw tightened. Touch her? Who said anything about touching her? "You have that look, sir." "I don't have a look." "You have the look you get before you have someone touched." Ji-hoon exhaled through his nose, something almost like a laugh, though his eyes stayed fixed on the photo. A woman kneeling in the rain beside his grandmother, ruining a pair of jeans that clearly mattered to her, gently pressing groceries into frail hands and refusing payment 3 times. He had built an empire on reading people in half a second, in boardrooms, in backrooms, in the particular silence of men deciding whether to betray him. And what he read in that photograph unsettled him more than any threat ever had. He read someone with nothing, giving anyway. "Find out who she is," he said quietly. "Everything. Quietly. I don't want her frightened, and I don't want her followed. Just find out." What Ji-hoon didn't say, what he barely allowed himself to think, was that the woman's face in that photograph had stirred something buried so deep he'd assumed it had died with his mother. A memory, half-formed, of a woman crouched beside him in a burning building's aftermath, wrapping a stranger's child, him, in her own coat. He had spent 11 years building walls other men called an empire. Kang Group's shipping and logistics wing alone moved 40% of the goods passing through Incheon's ports, a legitimate fortune vast enough to make him a fixture in Forbes' Korea. But it was the wing beneath the wing, the network only a handful of men understood, that made grown officials return his calls at 3 in the morning. He had inherited both halves from his grandfather, along with a singular, ironclad rule. Family is the only currency that cannot be counterfeited, borrowed, or stolen. Protect it absolutely. His grandmother, Kang Soon-ae, was the last living proof of that rule, and she had apparently decided to test her grandson's blood pressure by wandering off with no security in the middle of a downpour. Soon-ae sat in her sitting room an hour later, dry, changed, sipping barley tea as though nothing at all had happened, while her grandson paced in front of her like a man twice his 36 years. "You could have been hurt. I was hurt. My hip will remind me for a week." She said this with the same flat calm she might use to discuss weather. "But I wasn't in danger, Ji-hoon-ah. I was helped. By someone Suho is running a full background check on right now." "Of course he is." Soon-ae almost smiled into her tea. "Tell me, when you looked at that photograph, what did you see?" Ji-hoon stopped pacing. He hadn't told her what he'd seen. He hadn't told anyone. I saw someone who helped an old woman on the street. That's all. That's not all, and you know it. You went very quiet, the way your grandfather used to go quiet. Sune set down her cup with the precision of a woman who had spent 60 years learning exactly how much noise to make in a room full of powerful men. I have buried a husband, a son, and a daughter-in-law, Ji-hoon. I have exactly one grandchild left in this world, and he has not looked at a photograph like that in 11 years. Not once. Halmoni? I am not matchmaking, she said sharply, though the corner of her mouth betrayed her. I am telling you what I noticed, because someone in this family besides me should still be capable of noticing things that aren't spreadsheets and shipping manifests. Ji-hoon said nothing. He didn't need to. Somewhere behind his ribs, in the same place he kept the memory of his mother's voice and the sound of sirens on the worst night of his life, something had shifted the moment he saw that photograph. And he hated, more than almost anything, being read so easily. Adaeze, meanwhile, knew none of this. She finished her shift at Ia Ronki's restaurant close to midnight, the smell of suya spice and doenjang still clinging to her clothes, and walked home through streets finally emptied of rain. She thought about the old woman only once more that night, a small, warm thought, the kind you have about a stranger you'll likely never see again. Before sleep pulled her under. She had no way of knowing that a black car had idled outside her office tel for 20 minutes that evening, before quietly pulling away. No way of knowing that a folder was already being assembled on Kang Group letterhead containing her visa status, her employment history, her mother's death certificate, her brother's university records in Lagos, and, buried at the bottom, flagged and highlighted in red by an analyst who'd nearly dropped his coffee when he found it, a single line that would detonate everything. A connection neither Adaeze nor Kang Ji-hoon could have imagined. A name that appeared in both of their family records, 26 years apart, tied to an orphanage fire in Busan that the official report had called an accident. Adaeze slept peacefully that night, dreaming of her mother's kitchen in Enugu. 3 miles away, Kang Ji-hoon sat alone in his office long after midnight, staring at a single photograph on his monitor, unable to explain to himself why his hands weren't quite steady. The folder landed on Ji-hoon's desk at 7 the next morning, delivered by his head of internal affairs, a wiry, meticulous man named Director O, who had worked for the Kang family since before Ji-hoon was born and had never once in that time looked rattled. He looked rattled now. Sir, O said, setting the folder down with both hands as though it might spill. You'll want to sit for this one. Ji-hoon didn't sit. He rarely did what he was told. Even by the handful of people he trusted, absolutely. He opened the folder standing, scanning quickly. Name, visa status, employment, a photo of Adaeze's mother taken years ago outside a small church in Enugu, until his eyes caught on a name 3 pages in, and his whole body went still in the particular way of a man who has just watched the ground shift beneath a house he thought was built on rock. Sister Margaret Adaeze Bello, missionary, Busan Grace Orphanage, 1998 to 2000. That's not possible, he said quietly. I cross-referenced it 4 times, sir. Sister Margaret Bello was Adaeze Bello's aunt, her father's older sister. She worked as a missionary caregiver at Busan Grace Orphanage for 2 years before the fire. Ji-hoon set the folder down very carefully, as though it had suddenly become something that might detonate if handled wrong. The fire that killed my mother. Yes, sir. The Busan Grace Orphanage fire was not a story Ji-hoon told people. It was not a story he let himself think about in daylight. He had been 9 years old, staying with his mother, who volunteered there twice a month, teaching English to children whose own families had vanished into the machinery of poverty and shame, when the electrical fault in the East Wing turned a Tuesday evening into the worst night of his life. He remembered smoke. He remembered his mother's hands shoving him toward a window. He remembered dimly a woman's voice, not his mother's, screaming his name through the smoke, wrapping something around him, dragging him through a service door his mother had shown him only once. He did not remember his mother's face after that. He had never been allowed to see it. She had gone back in for 2 more children. She had not come back out. For 26 years, Kang Ji-hoon had believed the woman who pulled him from that fire was a nurse who died of smoke inhalation 3 days later. A name in an official report, a name on a small memorial plaque he visited once a year and never spoke of. He had never once wondered what became of her family. He had never once imagined that family might, one rainy Tuesday, be standing in an alley in Itaewon, refusing payment for a bag of groceries. "Sister Margaret," he said slowly, "is she alive?" "No, sir. Records show she died in 2000. Smoke inhalation, 3 days after the fire." Director O hesitated, choosing his next words with visible care. "The same 3 days as the woman credited in the official report with pulling you from the building." Ji-hoon looked up sharply. "Those are two different people in the report." "They were, sir, officially." O slid a second document across the desk. Older, the paper yellowed, a hospital admission record scanned from an archive that had clearly taken considerable effort and considerable money to access. "I believe, sir, that they were the same woman, and that somewhere along the way, 26 years ago, someone paid to make sure they weren't." The room went very quiet. Ji-hoon had spent his entire adult life believing his mother died trying to save 2 children she barely knew, alongside a nurse whose name he'd memorized off a plaque and never once thought to question. He had built shrines out of that story in the private architecture of his grief. And now a wiry, careful man was telling him that the woman who actually pulled him from that fire, who ran back in, who screamed his name through smoke thick enough to blind, might have been erased from history, replaced, renamed, and that her family was still alive. Still in Korea. One of them, currently, working double shifts and refusing payment for spilled groceries 3 miles from where he was standing. "Who erased her?" Ji-hoon said. It wasn't a question. Director O's silence was answer enough. "Say it." "Sir, the fire investigation 26 years ago was closed unusually fast, and the family who funded the orphanage's insurance settlement was..." O stopped, visibly weighing 30 years of loyalty against what he was about to say. "It was your father's business partner at the time, Chairman Yoo Tae-sung, now 81, still Chairman Emeritus of Yoo Holdings, still a fixture at every gala and boardroom. Ji-hoon had spent a decade learning to navigate. A man who had, for as long as Ji-hoon could remember, treated him with an unsettling, avuncular warmth Ji-hoon had never quite trusted and never quite understood. Ji-hoon sat down at last, slowly, the folder open before him, the weight of 26 years rearranging itself in his chest. "Halmoni cannot see this," he said finally. "Not yet. Not until I know exactly what happened and exactly why." "And the girl, sir? Adaeze Bello?" Ji-hoon looked at the photograph clipped to the folder's final page. Adaeze laughing with a coworker outside Ia Ronki's restaurant, unaware she was being photographed, unaware her aunt's name had just cracked open a 26-year-old lie, unaware that the old woman she'd helped in the rain was the grandmother of the man now staring at her face like it belonged to a ghost. "Watch her," Ji-hoon said. "Protect her. And whatever you do, do not let Chairman Yoo learn her name before I do." Outside his office window, Seoul glittered on, indifferent, while 3 floors below, a woman none of them yet knew, a housekeeper in Chairman Yoo's employ for 11 years, with her own reasons to fear that name, was quietly making a phone call she'd promised herself, a decade ago, she would never make. "He's asking about the fire," she whispered into the receiver. "Someone needs to warn him before it's too late." The housekeeper's name was Grace Nwosu, and she had spent 11 years perfecting the art of being invisible in Chairman Yoo Tae-sung's mansion, pouring tea without being seen pouring it, dusting shelves lined with photographs of a man who smiled for cameras and rarely for anyone else. She was Nigerian, like Adaeze, though from Onitsha rather than Enugu, and she had never once in 11 years mentioned that fact to her employer. There were things you learned to keep small in this house. Your accent, your opinions, your past. Her past was the problem now. She had been 19 years old and newly arrived in Korea when she'd taken her first job, not at the Yoo Mansion, but at Busan Grace Orphanage, alongside a warm, tireless missionary named Sister Margaret Bello, in the 2 years before the fire. Grace had left the orphanage 3 months before the blaze, chasing better pay in Seoul, and had spent every year since quietly grateful and quietly ashamed of being grateful that timing alone had spared her. She had also spent 11 years in Chairman Yu's employ, slowly, unwillingly, piecing together what really happened that night. Fragments overheard through doors left ajar, a burned insurance file she'd once glimpsed in a study she wasn't supposed to enter, a name, Sister Margaret's, that had been quietly scrubbed from every official document and replaced with another. She had told herself for years that saying nothing was survival, that the dead couldn't be helped, and the living needed their jobs. But when whispers reached the kitchen staff that Kang Ji-hoon's people were suddenly asking questions about the fire, questions that hadn't been asked in 26 years, Grace had felt something in her chest crack open that she'd bricked over a long time ago. She made the call from the pantry, her back against a shelf of imported olive oil, her voice barely above a breath. "This is Grace. I used to work at Busan Grace Orphanage. I need to speak with someone from the Kang family. It's about the fire, and it's about a girl named Bello." Adaeze felt the shift before she understood it. It started small. A black car she noticed twice outside the restaurant in 1 week, parked at a distance that felt deliberate. A new customer, a quiet, well-dressed man, who ordered jollof rice and lingered 3 hours over a single bowl, watching the door more than his food. Ronki noticed too, and voiced what Adaeze had been too tired, too used to being overlooked, to consider. "Someone is watching you, Adaeze," she said one evening, arms crossed, brow furrowed with the fierce protectiveness she extended to every young woman who walked through her door. "You did something, or you saw something. What was it?" "Nothing," Adaeze said, though her stomach had already tightened. "I helped an old woman with her groceries. That's all." "There is no that's all in this city, my dear. Not for people like us." Ronki's voice softened, worry replacing suspicion. "Be careful. Whatever this is." Adaeze told herself it was nothing. An odd coincidence. A lonely man's excuse to eat good jollof rice twice. But that night, walking home, she felt eyes on her back for the first time since arriving in Korea. And the feeling didn't leave, even after she'd locked her door 3 times and pressed her back against it, breathing hard for no reason she could name. 2 days later, an envelope was slipped under her door. No return address. Inside, a single photograph, herself, kneeling in the rain beside the old woman, the moment captured with startling clarity, and a note in careful, formal Korean accented English. "Miss Bello, someone would like to thank you properly for your kindness. Please come to Kang Tower, 40th floor, Thursday at 3 p.m. You will not be harmed. This is not a request you should refuse, but it is one you are free to." No signature. Just beneath the message, a small embossed emblem she didn't recognize, a phoenix wrapped around an anchor, the Kang Group crest. Adaeze sat on the edge of her narrow bed for a long time, the photograph trembling slightly in her hand, her mind racing through every possible explanation and landing on none that made sense. She thought of her mother's voice, years ago, warning her about a city that swallowed young women whole and gave nothing back. She thought of her aunt, Sister Margaret, a woman she'd never met but had grown up hearing about in hushed, reverent tones at every family gathering. The aunt who'd gone to Korea to do God's work and never come home, whose grave Adaeze's own father had never been given the chance to visit. She had no idea, sitting there in the lamplight, that the 2 threads of her life, the stranger she'd helped in the rain and the aunt whose death had haunted her family for a generation, were, at that very moment, being stitched together in a boardroom 40 floors above the city she'd learned to call home. She had no idea that Thursday at 3 p.m. would be the moment everything she thought she knew about her family's quiet, forgotten tragedy would come apart in her hands. She only knew, folding the photograph carefully back into its envelope, that she would go. Not because the note frightened her, because some instinct, older than fear, told her that this was the beginning of something her mother, wherever she was now, had been waiting 26 years for her to find. Kang Tower rose 42 stories above the Han River, all glass and quiet power, and Adaeze stood outside it Thursday afternoon in her one good blazer, feeling smaller than she had in years. She almost turned back twice. But her mother's voice? "Nay, you did not survive this much to be afraid now. pushed her through the revolving doors, past a lobby with ceilings that swallowed sound, into an elevator operated by a silent woman in a tailored uniform who pressed the button for the 40th floor without being asked. The doors opened onto a room that took her breath away, not with luxury, though it had that too, but with the sheer, deliberate calm of it. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a single low table, and at that table, rising to meet her, an old woman she recognized instantly, cane resting against her chair, eyes bright with something that looked almost like relief. "Halmoni," Adaeze breathed. "You came," Sune said, and for a moment, the careful, calculating woman from the boardroom photograph disappeared entirely, replaced by something simpler. An old woman genuinely glad to see a face that had been kind to her in the rain. "Sit, child. There is someone who would like to meet you properly. He is late, which is unlike him, and I intend to tell him so." As if summoned, the door opened behind her, and Adaeze turned to see the well-dressed man from the restaurant, the one who'd lingered 3 hours over jollof rice, step into the room, and behind the careful, composed mask he wore in every photograph she would later see of him, something raw flickered across his face at the sight of her. "You," Adaeze said, understanding arriving in pieces. "You were watching me." "I was making sure you were safe," Kang Ji-hoon said. "I apologize for the manner of it. I didn't know how else to be certain, without frightening you, that you were who my grandmother said you were." "And who am I?" Adaeze's voice held more steel than she felt. Whatever this was, however grand the room, however powerful the man standing in it, she had not survived 4 years alone in this city by letting powerful men rearrange her without explanation. "Because I'm fairly certain you didn't bring me 40 floors up to thank me for a bag of vegetables." Something that might have been respect moved behind Ji-hoon's eyes. He gestured for her to sit, and when she didn't move, he sat first, as though offering the first vulnerability might earn hers in return. 26 years ago, he said, there was a fire at Busan Grace Orphanage. My mother died in it, along with a woman the official report called a nurse. I was 9 years old. I was told for 26 years that this nurse's name was Han Mi-young, and that she died 3 days later of smoke inhalation, alongside my mother's memory, a footnote in a tragedy no one wanted examined too closely. Adaeze's chest had gone very tight. I don't understand what this has to do with. Her name wasn't Han Mi-young. Ji-hoon's voice didn't waver, though something beneath it clearly caused him to keep steady. I believe my staff have found records that strongly suggest that the woman who pulled me out of that fire, who went back in for 2 more children and never came back out, was a missionary named Sister Margaret Adaeze Bello. The room seemed to tilt. That's not possible's whispered, though even as she said it, something in her, some old, unexamined ache, recognized the shape of a truth she'd never been given. My aunt. Sister Margaret was my aunt. My father's sister. She died in a fire at an orphanage. That's all we ever knew. The Korean government sent a letter, a settlement, some money, an apology. We were never told details. My father never got to see where she was buried. He asked for years, and no one would tell him. Because someone made sure no one could, Ji-hoon said quietly. Someone changed her name in the official record. Someone paid to make her disappear from a story that was by every right hers. Who? Ji-hoon and his grandmother exchanged a glance loaded with 26 years of things neither of them had ever said aloud. We don't know yet, not with certainty, Ji-hoon said. But we have a name we're afraid of being right about. A man my family has trusted for 3 decades. A man who funded the orphanage's insurance settlement personally and made sure the investigation closed within a week. He paused. Chairman Yu Tae-sung. The name meant nothing to Adaeze. She had never moved in circles where it would, but she watched Sune's knuckles whiten around her cane, watched Ji-hoon's jaw tighten in a way that told her this was not a small danger he was naming. Why, Adaeze asked slowly, would anyone want to erase the name of a woman who died saving children? It was Sune who answered, her voice low, ancient with a grief she'd apparently carried alone for a quarter century. Because, child, dead heroes ask no questions. But a missionary with a living family, a family that might one day ask what really started that fire, and why it started in the one wing of the building where the insurance inspection had flagged faulty wiring 3 months earlier and nothing had been repaired. That woman is dangerous, even after she's gone. Adaeze felt the floor shift beneath a life she'd thought she understood completely. A dead aunt, a grieving father, an unexplained tragedy folded quietly into family history and never questioned. Because what good did questions do the dead? She had crossed an ocean carrying her mother's dreams, and had never once imagined she might also be carrying, unknowingly, the thread of a 26-year-old cover-up that reached into one of the most powerful families in Korea. "Why tell me this now?" she asked. "Why not just leave it buried? You're powerful. You could have found all this and said nothing." Ji-hoon looked at her with an intensity that made her chest ache in a way she didn't have a name for yet. Because the woman who died pulling me out of that fire deserves her name back. And because her niece knelt in the rain for a stranger without knowing who that stranger was, or what it might cost her to find out. He paused. "I don't intend to let it cost you anything. But I need you to know, before you decide whether to walk away from this room and never look back, Chairman Yu has resources and reach and 26 years of practice making inconvenient truths disappear." Adaeze's phone buzzed once in her pocket. A text from an unknown number, 3 words long, that made the blood drain from her face before she'd even fully processed it. "We know already. Below them, 40 floors down, a black car, identical to the ones that had been quietly watching her all week, idled outside Kang Tower's entrance. Except this one didn't belong to Ji-hoon's people." Ji-hoon crossed the room in 3 strides and took the phone from her trembling hands before she'd even fully registered she was still holding it out. He read the message once, his expression unreadable, then handed it to Suho, who had appeared silently at the door the moment the mood in the room shifted. "Trace it," Ji-hoon said. "Now." "It won't trace to him directly," Sun-ae said quietly, rising from her chair with the slow, deliberate strength of a woman who had survived worse rooms than this one. "Tae-sung never touches anything with his own hands. That's how he's lasted this long." "Then whose hands touched it?" Adaeze asked, and something in her voice, a thread of the same steel that had carried her through 4 years of a city that never once made room for her, made both Kangs look at her with something closer to respect than pity. The answer came within the hour, and it came not from Suho's tracing, but from a shaking phone call to the front desk of Kang Tower, from a woman who refused to give her name to anyone but Kang Ji-hoon directly. Grace Nwosu sat in Ji-hoon's office 20 minutes later, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and told them everything. The 2 years at Busan Grace Orphanage, alongside Sister Margaret, the burned insurance file glimpsed through a half-open study door, the fragments of conversation overheard across 11 years of pouring tea and dusting shelves for a man who had never once suspected the quiet Nigerian housekeeper understood far more Korean than she let on. He talks on the phone in his study, late at night, when he thinks the house is asleep, Grace said, her voice steadying as the story poured out of her, 11 years of silence finally breaking. "I heard him once, maybe 6 years ago, say a name, Han Mi-young, and laugh. Not the way you laugh about someone you cared for, the way you laugh about a problem you solved a long time ago." She looked up, meeting Adaeze's eyes for the first time, 2 Nigerian women 3,000 miles from home, recognizing something old and shared between them. "I am sorry I never said anything. I told myself the truth couldn't help the dead. I was wrong. It can still help the living. The wiring," Ji-hoon said slowly, piecing it together with the cold precision of a man dismantling a bomb. "The insurance flag 3 months before the fire. If Yu Holdings owned a stake in the orphanage's building maintenance contract..." "He did," Grace said. "I've seen the old documents. He inherited the maintenance company from his father. If the wiring had been reported and fixed, it would have cost almost nothing. If it burned down instead, with insurance already flagging prior negligence conveniently buried. The settlement paid out 3 times the repair cost would have," Ji-hoon finished, "and nobody asked questions, because a hero teacher and a hero nurse died trying to save children, and grief doesn't leave room for accounting audits." The room went silent with the particular horror of a truth finally given its full shape. Not a tragic accident, but a tragedy of neglect, dressed in the clothing of misfortune, profitable enough that the man responsible had spent 26 years wealthy, respected, and utterly unbothered. "He's known we're asking questions for days now," Ji-hoon said. That text wasn't a threat meant to scare Adaeze into silence. It was a message meant for me. He's telling me he knows exactly how close I am, and that he isn't worried. Should he be? Sune asked, very quietly, and there was something in the old woman's voice. Grief that had waited 26 years to become something sharper, that made Adaeze understand for the first time exactly how dangerous the Kang family's calm truly was. Ji-hoon looked at Adaeze then, and his voice, when it came, was gentler than anything she'd yet heard from him. "I won't pretend this is simple, or that it ends cleanly. Chairman Yu has spent 3 decades building alliances that would survive almost any accusation I could bring publicly. A confession from a housekeeper and a burned insurance file glimpsed through a doorway won't be enough in a courtroom. I need something harder, something he can't buy his way around." "What do you need?" Adaeze asked. "The truth, from someone he can't silence." Ji-hoon hesitated, and for the first time since she'd met him, Adaeze saw something close to uncertainty cross his face. "Your aunt kept records, according to the orphanage's old logs. Informal ones, notes on the children in her care, correspondence with your family in Nigeria. If any of those survived, if your father kept any of her letters." "He kept everything," Adaeze said quietly, her heart suddenly pounding with a hope she hadn't let herself feel in years. Every letter she ever sent him, from the day she left Enugu until the last one, 3 weeks before the fire. He has a box. He's kept it under his bed for 26 years. He used to take it out on her birthday and just hold it. He never showed anyone what was inside. Ji-hoon's eyes met hers, and something passed between them that neither of them had a name for yet. Not quite trust, not quite something warmer, but the fragile beginning of both. "Call him," Ji-hoon said. "Tonight, ask him what's in that box." Adaeze's hands shook as she dialed her father's number. The Lagos country code feeling, for the first time in years, like a lifeline instead of a reminder of distance. The phone rang twice before her father's voice, warm and worn with age, answered. "Ne, is everything all right? It's very late for you to call." "Papa," Adaeze said, her voice breaking on the word, 26 years of unanswered family grief rising in her throat all at once. "I need you to tell me about Auntie Margaret's last letter. I need you to tell me everything she wrote." There was a long silence on the line, the particular silence of a man who has waited a quarter century for someone, anyone, to finally ask. "She wrote," her father said slowly, "that she was frightened, that she'd found something in the building's old inspection files she wasn't supposed to see, and that she was going to report it, no matter what it cost her." His voice cracked. "She wrote that if anything happened to her, I should know it wasn't an accident. I never told anyone, Adaeze. I thought grief had made her paranoid. I thought no one would believe a missionary's fears over a chairman's grief. I was ashamed. I never even tried." Adaeze looked up at Ji-hoon, tears streaming freely down her face, and said the words that would change everything that came after. "She has the letter, Papa. She wrote it all down, and I think it's finally time the world heard it." Behind her, unseen, Ji-hoon's phone buzzed with a message from Director Oh, 3 words that turned the room's fragile hope instantly cold. "Chairman Yu knows about the letters. He's already moving." The next 48 hours moved like something out of a fever dream, the kind Adaeze would later struggle to describe even to her own children, years down the line, when the story of how their parents met had long since become family legend. Ji-hoon moved with a speed that startled even his own people. Within hours, a private jet had been arranged, and Adaeze found herself, for the first time in 4 exhausting years, flying home. Not as the woman who'd left with nothing but a suitcase and her mother's prayers, but as a woman flanked by a security detail, racing against a man who had spent 3 decades learning exactly how to make inconvenient truths disappear. Her father met them at the airport in Lagos, older than she remembered, his hands trembling as he embraced her for the first time in 4 years. He led them to the small house in Enugu where Adaeze had grown up. To the box beneath his bed he'd guarded like scripture, and with hands that shook from more than age, he lifted out a stack of letters bound in faded ribbon. His sister's handwriting, careful and looping, chronicling 2 years of a life spent caring for children an ocean away. The last letter was 3 pages long. Sister Margaret had written not just of her fear, but of specifics. A date, an inspector's name, a maintenance report she'd photographed with a borrowed camera and mailed a copy of to a mission headquarters in Lagos, believing in her quiet, stubborn faith that someone somewhere would keep it safe even if something happened to her. That copy still existed, buried in a mission archive that hadn't been touched in 2 decades. It took Director Oh's team 11 hours and considerable persuasion to locate it, but when they did, it was everything Ji-hoon needed. A photographed maintenance report, dated, stamped, showing faulty wiring flagged 3 months before the fire. A letter in a dead woman's own hand, naming her fear and the man she believed responsible for ignoring it. And Grace Nwosu, finally willing to put her name to 11 years of overheard truths in a sworn statement that would hold up in any courtroom Chairman Yu's lawyers could construct. It wasn't enough to send an 81-year-old man to prison. His lawyers made sure of that, dragging what proceedings did occur into a slow, grinding settlement rather than a trial. But it was enough to strip away everything that had protected him for 26 years. The board of Yu Holdings, faced with irrefutable evidence and the very public, very unstoppable weight of Kang Group's backing, forced his resignation within the month. His name, quietly and permanently, was removed from the halls and buildings that had once borne it with pride. The insurance settlement he'd profited from was reopened, and a new one, larger, this time paid directly and publicly to the Bello family, and to every family whose child had died or been harmed in that fire, was finally, after 26 years, made right. And Sister Margaret Adaeze Bello's name was restored, carved at Ji-hoon's insistence and at his own expense, into a new memorial plaque outside the rebuilt Busan Grace Orphanage, beside the name of Kang Ji-hoon's mother. The 2 women who had died together finally remembered together, exactly as they'd lived their last moments, side by side, refusing to leave children behind. Adaeze stood before that plaque on a bright spring morning 8 months later, her father beside her, his first trip to Korea, a journey he'd never imagined making, and Kang Soon-ae on her other side, leaning slightly on her cane, no longer needing to pretend her steadiness was anything but genuine affection. "She would be proud of you," Soon-ae said quietly, watching Adaeze trace her aunt's engraved name with careful fingers. "Not just for finding the truth, for the kindness that led you to it. My grandson didn't fall in love with a mystery child. He fell in love with a woman who knelt in the rain for a stranger who had nothing to offer her in return." Adaeze looked up to find Ji-hoon a short distance away, watching her with the same unguarded expression she'd first glimpsed months ago in a boardroom 40 floors above the city. Not the calculating chairman the world saw, but a man who had spent 11 years building walls around a 9-year-old's grief and had finally, quietly, let one woman's kindness begin to take them down. She hadn't paid for an old woman's groceries, expecting anything in return. She certainly hadn't expected to find her aunt's stolen legacy, her family's 26-year-old grief finally answered, or a love story woven so tightly into justice that she could no longer imagine one without the other. But destiny, her mother used to say, rarely announces itself with fanfare. Sometimes it simply asks you to kneel in the rain for a stranger, and trusts you'll do it anyway, even when you have no idea what it will cost, or what it will give back tenfold. Adaeze Bello had knelt without hesitation, and an old woman's quiet gratitude had, in the end, given her back everything her family had lost, and a future none of them could have dreamed of, standing together now in the spring sunlight, finally, fully